And this, to be clear, was Jeff Kaplan's design goal. This is what Jeff Kaplan and Jeff Goodman wanted. You will never have a game in 6v6 where you have 7,000 damage and 7 elims. The only tank that was just dropped into Overwatch 2 that didn't need reworks, didn't need anything, I think he might have gotten nerfed a little bit, and he still has been dominant on his maps for the entirety of the game. Boys, remember, if you like my content and you want to continue to support me and speaking my mind and giving new ideas out there that are really unfiltered, which is kind of hard to find nowadays, I guess, be sure to help me out and support us on Patreon, where you get all kinds of like coaching assets and many other things. Be sure to check it out down in the description. It has everything you need. Thank you guys so much. Got Spylo with the video. I tested 6v6 to prove everyone wrong. Let's give it a watch.
I played, tested, studied, strategized, analyzed, and theorized 6v6 for 25 hours the last few weeks, utilizing 2 different versions of the 6v6 workshop code, playing both main tank, off tank, damage, and support, all while playing and spectating lobbies from Platinum.
So he and I talked about this a little bit, but I'm glad I waited for this video to show what was going on, because my biggest issue with the defense of 5v5 was not what players preferred or didn't, but the reasons cited being inaccurate, wrong, and just frankly misleading or intentionally misinformation, I would say. I'm not saying everybody had ill intent, but there were a lot of things that weren't true that were being said that I believe this video is going to debunk, and I'm very, very excited for it.
To Grandmaster. Today I'm going to be sharing everything you need to know and prepare for with Overwatch's upcoming 6v6 experiment. For those who don't know me, my name is Spylo. I'm a professional Overwatch coach with over 10,000 hours of private coaching experience, all heroes, all roles. But more than that, I'm also someone who's coached in the esports scenes at both the Contenders and the Overwatch League level for 5 years. 3 of those coaching double shield, goats, dive comps, and every variation of 6v6 composition that's ever been meta. Point being, I know the game, I know its theory in both the 5v5 and 6v6 format from both the bronze level to the professional. One disclaimer I do need to get out of the way is that while the developers of the workshop codes I used did a phenomenal job putting it all together, in fact I interviewed them, you can check that out here, it's not Blizzard endorsed officially. It's simply our best guess at how 6v6 may look in the future test. The good news is that while the details and hero viabilities may...
And by the way, those community developers did a better job than the balance team of the people paid to maintain the game. At least at 6v6. That community code solved all of the problems and pain points that Overwatch 1 had in one patch. One patch. And I think with the recent articles coming out talking about Jeff Kaplan and the issue of the philosophies colliding at Activision Blizzard, colliding / clashing at Activision Blizzard, it's clear that there was a major internal issue at the company, and games like Overwatch paid the price because of it.
Change between now and then. The theory that we're going to be talking about today will not. Before we talk about 6v6, let's talk briefly about why Overwatch went to 5v5 in the first place and why it's considering going back. First off was Sustain Watch. Overwatch had a series of really unfortunate metas, whether it was double shield and a lot of other metas that just basically revolved around not taking space, not taking angles, denying the fun of a lot of the more fun support and DPS hero categories, with the goal of just going towards moving into big clumps, denying off angles.
And this, to be clear, was Jeff Kaplan's design goal. This is what Jeff Kaplan and Jeff Goodman wanted. They might not have realized that's what they were creating, but this was the end outcome of their design philosophy. I asked Jeff Kaplan himself in a dev Q&A in the creator Discord in 2020. And I remember specifically asking if they plan to address problematic heroes like Brigitte, who reward you far more than you're required to put in. And their response was they wanted to have a complicated game at first and make it easier over time. But when you look into the practice as to what they put into the game to make the game easier, it just replaced skillful heroes. It replaced taking angles. It replaced the mid-fight of what made Overwatch a beautiful game. And you can look at all of the DLC heroes that did this. Brigitte, even Brigitte compared to a hero like Ana or Lucio. She has 4 times the volume of Lucio's heal. Nobody knows this even to this day because it doesn't show. And even in Overwatch 2, she was outperforming Wauga when he was pay to win across every rank with the highest win rate across every rank in the game of any hero. Brigitte did. Right? So when Brig doesn't have to actually look around the map and actively heal somebody, and she can heal and peel at the same time. Like when you're playing Ana, you can't do damage to somebody and heal your team at the same time. You have to make that decision. And that's what made the game have depth. Brig out heals Lucio. Yeah, her volume is 4 times as big. Brig's range for her Inspire and how much it heals everybody around her is 4 times the volume in a spear of Lucio. It's enormous. It is enormous, and she can combine that with burst heal packs. She's a fundamentally flawed hero in that she just does everything at once. Sigma is another example of that compared to Reinhardt, where, again, he had sustain abilities with grasps comparable to Rein, but he could do range poke and stun with his shield. How is that fair compared to a hero like Reinhardt? And the answer is that it's not. They thought they were making the game easier by putting heroes in the game that did more at once. That didn't actually make the game easier. It didn't help the game at the skill floor. It broke the game at the skill ceiling because you're simply putting in stronger characters in the previous iteration. So those heroes are going to replace the original cast, which is what happened with Overwatch 2. Or sorry, with Overwatch 1. That's why you saw Double Shield dominate for so long. And the reality is all they had to do was nerf those characters accordingly. But they never did because they abandoned the first game to go work on this sequel, which has not been better. And it hasn't delivered on a single real promise that it made gameplay-wise either.
Sustained
Aside
shields,
from Q times.
more healing, and more healing. This was a big issue because of a lot of hero design and balance issues were not addressed back in Overwatch 1. You see, say what you will about Overwatch 2, but the design and balance philosophy happens at a much more rapid rate. Back in Overwatch 1, we often had months and months with both metas and no patch changes. And then finally, when the patch did come through with some minor, tiny little number tweak to healing, I mean, come on.
The Overwatch team has faced some criticism for being a little bit slow when it comes to our balance patches.
Yeah, they only tried to nerf Brig 25 times. And she still was one of the first meta characters coming into pro play in the Overwatch League. Because all they did was change her numbers around. They never made a fundamental change to the character in the fact that she could do everything at once, right? She could do everything at once, and they never tackled it. They ran away, they changed formats, they refused to address the flawed designs they put in the game, and Jeff Goodman was accountable for that.
This is also after the release of original Shield, Orisa, Sigma, Baptiste, Brig, and Moira, all characters that contributed to the Sustain Watch group up, just tank it out, and just basically out-healing any sort of pressure. Notoriously a meta that was very unfriendly to a lot of the dive, more fun, and more popular characters like Reinhardt, Genji, Winston, Ana, and so on. Now, this was not necessarily a 6v6 issue. As we're going to talk about in a little bit here, there's a lot of ways in 6v6 could have functioned without this and done just fine. The problem was that a lot of the hero designs and balance done at that time was really, really bad. Regardless of whether this was a major factor in going to 5v5, I definitely think it was a minor factor because it was certainly a factor that moved us into role queue. Next up, individual impact through space, because this is something that when we're going into a first-person shooter that's going free to play, is people need to have a little bit, or need to feel like they have a little bit more individual playmaking. Now, whether 5v5 succeed with that is up for debate, but one thing's for certain is that
Hint, the answer is no. 5v5, and I recorded a video about the state of DPS, like 5v5 failed on giving more individual impact. It failed. How am I as a DPS supposed to kill a tank? You don't. In Overwatch 1, you could. Granted, the kills weren't worth as much, and it made more people have more opportunity to turn a fight, and there was more that had to go into the fight. But there's a reason why all of the big claims they made about Overwatch 2 and why it would be better pre-release, they changed their mind on because they realized the reality was different, and they wanted to save face.
One player technically does have more impact on the battlefield in Overwatch 2 now. Finally, and maybe most importantly, were queue times. Now, I'm not going to go into details here. There's a great developer blog post
This is
on
the one thing
Basically,
that they
queue times
did do.
for tank were a big, big bottleneck. Partly because tank is just not the most popular role in any game, period. And secondly, because tank was plagued with a lot of really crappy, unpopular hero designs. Sigma's done better since Overwatch 2, but Sigma in Overwatch 1, Orisa in Overwatch 1, and a lot of the other tanks that were meta in Overwatch 1, it just wasn't a very fun role to play. So not only were tank players not very common, but tank was plagued with a lot of heroes that people just didn't want to be forced to play. So the question is, after all that, why are we reconsidering 6v6? First off, let's talk about the philosophy about why 5v5 has had its issues. Number one is the solo tank problem, of where when you only have one person taking the attention, taking space, baiting attention, you could feel a little bit like a human punching bag. And with two tanks, yes, you were a lot squishier, but at least you had the opportunity to have somebody else split the attention with you. In addition to that, a lot of the design philosophy around solo tank has leaned more into the raid boss style of things instead of having basically a slightly tankier DPS. And so what we have are these giga raid boss tanks that feel almost impossible to do anything to, and they can definitely introduce a lot of pain points into gameplay. I will say that it doesn't
Especially for the
necessarily mean that
DPS
tank is
role.
always the most impactful role. It often is, but Gavin Winter has elaborated that, at least at the higher ranks, the convergence of which role contributes the most to winning a game is actually really close. And so that's good news from a balance perspective, but it doesn't necessarily make the game more fun to play. In addition to that,
I'd love to see that metric, because there are a ton of times where a tank player makes a mistake, and because they are a tank and they have all these passives, like, they might not make a play to win, but they passively deny my ability to make a play to win. So I don't think any stat can really show that, but we'll see.
obviously, with the announcement of solo tank, a lot of off-tank players, people that used to play D.Va, Zarya, and so on back in Overwatch 1, were rightfully concerned. And that's definitely been a big loss of the 5v5, is losing the off-tank identity of many of those characters and the tank synergy that so many people enjoy. In addition to that, the variety of tank combos is obviously just completely gone. One of the nice things about having 2 tanks is that introducing a new character into the hero pool is that you're going to have multiple different ways of comboing that character with all of the tanks. But when a new tank is introduced, you're just going to play it and nothing else. It can make the game feel a little bit more samey, because instead of adding this new tank in combination with all the other tanks, it's just a new tank by itself. Finally, perhaps we have a little bit more confidence in our balance team to make aggressive changes as necessary for 6v6. You see, part of the reason why people have such a negative opinion of 6v6 is, that, as I said earlier, the design and balance of many of the characters at the time. Nowadays, while things can still be pretty ugly, at least there's quick adjustments and things that are willing to try and then dial back if it doesn't work. I don't think we would have had double shield with the current Overwatch 2 balance team for as long as we did. So
agree.
how do we actually try 6v6? And this is where the workshop comes into play here. The workshop is a tool developed in Overwatch 1 that allows people to make up their own custom games and really get quite complicated with it. What the workshop developers attempted to do is bring back Overwatch 1 for those who wanted to try it. It wasn't really competition with the current developers of Overwatch 2, so much as an opportunity to go back and play the game the way that you remembered it. My adjustments that I made to this was to introduce the Season 9 projectile and health changes that I feel will not be reverted. You see, one of the limitations of the workshop code is that with the increase of projectile sizes in Season 9, they were not able to revert those. So while they had the original health pools of Overwatch 1, all the projectiles were easier, so it basically meant everyone was getting 2-shot. Didn't feel that was a very honest testing ground for what Overwatch 2 is likely to have in the future. So what I did is I had post-Season 9 health pools, post-Season 9 projectile sizes, and to give that as our testing environment for today. So overall, we're going to be looking at the good and the bad, noting that no matter the format, there will be upsides and downsides. So please draw your own conclusions from your own testing, and also reserve final judgment, of course, until you finally actually test the 6v6 thing, because this is just our best guess. Immediately upon testing, I noticed that Sustain Watch was a lot weaker. Orisa's reworked the mobility creep of some of the cast, the weaker position of some of the sustain/poke heroes like Baptiste, Brig, and Hanzo, especially in the code, made it feel nearly impossible to just turtle and sustain. And we tried. We tried with the best variation of double shield. We tried running Bat Brig, and a lot of those combinations just didn't really work that well. On the code that we played, and what feels like the direction of Overwatch 2 in general, is that mobility and higher skill heroes felt a little bit more dominant. This was good because it shows that while
That's
the
fun in
Overwatch 2
both-
development team has
listen.
had its hiccups,
That's more fun in general. Like, regardless of the state of the game, more hypermobile dive-esque comps with that reward proactivity have always been received better in Overwatch, regardless if that's Overwatch 1 or Overwatch 2. The most hated metas that I've seen have been slow, sustain, poke metas, because an FPS game is about playmaking. If the game gets to a state where play denial is better than play making more consistently, then the game's not fucking fun. It's just boring, regardless of format.
overall the game has moved a little bit away from the teeth-grindingly slow sustain aspects of Overwatch 1, even if you do bring back 6v6. And this means that one of the big arguments against 6v6 may not be near as much of a problem as people think. The bad news? Well, ignoring the queue times issue, which may be improved with making more appealing tank design, two specific problems stood out, and we're going to go into these in very thorough detail. Number one, the space problem. Space is just generally more contested in 6v6 with or without double shields, often limiting solo capability to retake that space. Some of this is a stylistic choice, however. Number two is the hero problem. 6v6 did not seem to solve many of the tank hero design problems, even with some of the balancing efforts done by the 6v6 developers. We're going to elaborate deeply on both of these points because both are extremely important to fixing 6v6 in the future. First off, let's talk about the space problem. Many of the 6v6 fears comes from bad memories of being held hostage in a 2CP choke with double shield. The good news is that while space was an issue, it was less of an issue than I expected, partly due to the reduction of sustain watch, what we talked about earlier, but it's also because map design in Overwatch 2 has evolved for the better. That being said, even without as bad chokes, there's still a clear increase in defenders advantage in 6v6.
It is
tank
harder.
setup plus proximity, being able to close a distance, is still a major factor in controlling space. Let me demonstrate. So if we look here, Havana first defense here. Essentially, you have two.
This is a map issue. This is a bad map design issue right here. I love the Havana example, but that's because this map should not exist in the game. It's one of the worst designed maps of all time. It should get removed or reworked completely. It's fucking terrible. I agree. It's dog shit in 5v5 too.
2 tanks split on either side of the choke. In Overwatch 2, with 5v5, there's more space for the enemy team to rotate around right side to attack the high ground, and it's a little bit harder for the enemy team to control that space. If there's anybody controlling that space, it's going to be a DPS or support, which is a little bit easier to clear out at that proximity. However, if you replace that DPS with a tank, that tank is very difficult to clear out, because to get a sightlane to poke that tank out,
but this is a map, this is a Habana-specific problem.
And to close the distance to quote-unquote brawl that tank out, well, that's just a lot harder to do to a tank than it is to a DPS or support. Anytime there's any sort of choke where a tank can basically play around a corner, contest space, close the sight lines, it can feel a little bit harder to retake space in 66. And I found this to be the case on a lot of maps, Kings Row, Flashpoint, and so on. Although, interestingly enough, on Flashpoint, just because of how broad the maps were, 66 felt a lot less congested. The problem here is that a lot of people like to push out this narrative, which is definitely true to extent, that in 66 it's easier to poke out the tank because you have less HP. But the problem with that is that's not always possible with Defender's advantage. You see, tanks in Overwatch 2, largely as a whole, are all stronger up close. Now, they're not necessarily stronger up close to each other, but they're definitely stronger up close to squishies. For example, Sigma is largely seen as a poke tank, but if you get up close to Sigma as a squishy, that's a really, really bad matchup for 99% of the cast. And so
and that is a hero design issue. Sigma has been overkitted since he was put in the game. Sigma is the only character, the only tank that was just dropped into Overwatch 2 that didn't need reworks, didn't need anything. I think he might have gotten nerfed a little bit, and he still has been dominant on his maps for the entirety of the game. He was, because he was overkitted. All of the original cast had to get kitted up to the point where he was, and they still did not perform as well as he did. Sigma is one of the most overtuned heroes they've ever put in the game. Great trailer, like really cool character personality-wise. He's just got way too much on his kit. It's that simple. He's overkitted. He's still overkitted now. So 100% Sigma would have some issues. But like, again, that's because he is simply overkitted. That's all it is. He was overkitted the moment he was put in the game.
Problem with that is that anytime that you have any corners, choke points where there are multiple lines of attack, it can be very easy as defending tanks in 66 to choke out all those sight lines and force you to close the distance onto the tank to create space. It's not so easy to just simply take an angle and poke out the tank and a lot of these choke points. And while if you do get the opportunity to do that, it's very effective. If you don't, you're really relying off of your tank to take the space for you.
Absolutely. And that's why Sigma was a huge problem. This is a Sigma specific issue. Diva has risk when she commits. Sig has like very little risk, has so much on his kit. Sigma needs to get nerfed drastically. Like, he's to this day insanely powerful. The only reason he hasn't gotten nerfed is because he's good on his maps, and that's really it. But he's insanely powerful. Insane. He's been overkitted from launch.
The importance of mobility and range to open up different angles cannot be understated. Many of the times where I felt choked out, it's because I was playing a DPS character or a support character that didn't have the mobility to choose all the angles that I wanted to. And that definitely left some DPS, some supports feeling really good in the tank trades and some feeling really bad. Elaborating on this, this is partly why hit scan was such a hit or miss, no pun intended, in this exact same game mode. When I had Defender's Advantage as a hit scan, or when we had Defender's Advantage as a hit scan, it felt very oppressive because to get to the hit scan, you had to kind of crank through two angles that tanks were holding in close range. But attacking as a hit scan when you didn't have space could feel very miserable because closing the distance with most hit scan characters just isn't really a good option, even if the tanks are a little bit squishier. So finding angles and sightlines felt a lot more difficult. I found the binary impact of hit scan sometimes oppressive in defense, sometimes underwhelming on attack, to be a very difficult problem to solve with 66, especially with characters like Widowmaker, who went from being completely worthless in some situations in our testing to being absolutely untouchable. You are very reliant on your tanks to create space. So this is again where the 66 versus 5v5 preference is. Do you prefer the more team coordination of taking space with your tanks, or do you prefer the individual opportunity or the individual impact of 5v5? It's why Overwatch 2 feels more deathmatchy. Not that there's necessarily less strategy, there's just more space, so there's more individual opportunity to take and hold space appropriately. It's more democratic, and there's no real guaranteed safety really in any position that you're holding because there's always another angle the enemy team could take. In addition to that, I want to point out there's also a serious hero design discrepancy at taking different types of space. You see, a lot of the ugly stepchildren of hero design like Malga, Roadhog really struggle taking space when they could just constantly get poked out. You're very reliant on your tank trade to take space, so if you don't necessarily have the right tank combo to break the choke, then you might have a bad time, even though those chokes are better. The big difference is there's more individual autonomy in 5v5, but also one bad apple can ruin the bunch a lot easier. Do you find the tank trade / complexity of using CDs on the enemy tanks with your tanks to scratch your competitive itch? Tank players especially like this, and for good reason. It's a lot of fun. Or do you like the complexity responsibility of reading the situation and the space available to you as a DPS or support player? Overwatch 2 has more options in that category. On the flip side, Overwatch 1 has objectively more immediate complexity on the tank trades, where Overwatch 2 has objectively objectively more immediate complexity in positioning and controlling space. As often by the time we're considering the control of the space outside the tank trade, the fight may already be decided. For example, if I were to take a Route 66 attack with double bubble Winston Zarya trade, my Winston Zarya might need to try to look for a favorable angle on the enemy tank, try to set up a DPS angle at the same time, and then off of that trade, look for the opportunity to stage for backline as a final result. Whereas in 5v5, you can more immediately set up your DPS on the high ground, the left side, the low ground on the right side, and look for a trade off of your Winston dive.
It's Overwatch Lite. 5v5 is Overwatch Lite edition. Overwatch 2 should have been mobile. Would have been great. They would have popped off in Asia with that. PUBG Mobile is pretty big too.
Makes things a little bit more creative for your DPS, but definitely limits your tank options. So how does this affect DPS players? Well, there's more targets to shoot, but the choices in practice are generally not always super available. You can put a lot more pressure as a DPS character onto tanks now than you were before, but you might not always have the positions that you'd like to actually shoot what you'd like to shoot. So there's more options if you can get the space, but you probably won't always get that exact same space. However, for certain characters that have more mobility, I found this to be a little bit less of an issue.
And when the tanks actually come to deny the space you're on, which does happen a lot in 5v5, you actually have a chance of winning the fight for that space. Now, you almost have to kite away every single time. But when you're fighting for space in 6v6 against a weaker tank, you have a chance to win the fight. Currently, in Overwatch 2, you have no chance of winning that fight. The game becomes much more dynamic in that case when that happens.
We'll talk more about that later. Supports. There's just more responsibility to heal. There's now 2 tanks to heal, even if the health pools are a little bit smaller, so you're going to be doing more of that. And also, there's a little bit worse individual matchup versus poking a tank. Now, that definitely got better in 66, but unfortunately, a lot of support characters just don't do great versus tanks and damage, with the exception of maybe like Zen or Bap. So even though tanks are a little bit squishy, that's not really going to change how you position all that much compared to damage characters that just generally burn tanks better. This means the support with positioning is generally impacted a lot more in terms of not being able to take proactive angles near as much. You remember early Overwatch 2 where every support player was crying that they were dying off of cooldown? Well, that was part of the adjustment required for support players to be a lot more proactive and a lot more duel oriented. Going back to 6v6 would be dialing this back, going the opposite direction. Not a bad thing, but again, personal preference. I found support skill expression to be diminished slightly, tank to increase slightly, and DPS feels about the same, just different. Finally, some heroes are going to leave you feeling gatecapped in terms of taking space, just like it did back in Overwatch 1. Off of that, let's segue into hero design problems. Let's talk about the good first. Some heroes felt pretty darn good from our testing. Doomfist, Junker Queen, and individual hero tweaks like Rhine Pin Cancel all functioned really nicely in the new environment. Oh, and both enabler tanks, Zarya and Eva, felt great again, as their original identity has been restored. The bad, well, Malga had his moments, but felt demanding of the right tank combo to function. Turns out self-heal on the enemy tank isn't such a great design. Ramatra felt sluggish and survival-focused, and his long but overly impactful CD cycle left him with massive windows of vulnerability, like a Winston bubble but without the mobility of Monkey. Orisa lacks all identity besides focus tank in Overwatch 2, and so therefore that carries over to Overwatch 1, but that's now much worse as she benefits less from other tanks supporting her, and she doesn't really support the other tanks either. And then Roadhog, well, he's just awful in every single way. Turns out that while some heroes definitely feel better in the 66 format, notably off tanks, some heroes don't. Turns out a bad apple is still a bad apple, and a different, even better format doesn't change that. My experience with playing versus some of the bad apples mentioned before was a funny balance of being amused at how inconsistent and awkward they were compared to the voluptuous tank combos of Winston, Ryan, Zarya, Doomfist, Diva, Ball, and Junker Queen, and how annoyed it made me when we had one of those heroes in my team, especially when we didn't have space. You see, that's probably the biggest consistent theme between Roadhog, Orisa, Malga, and to an extent Ramatra. They all either have glaring weaknesses in their defensive capabilities, usually reliance on sustain or just survival, are tank buster focused, something that's a lot more awkward in the double tank format, or severely lacking consistent mobility or range. Pre-rework Orisa Roadhog were horrible to play versus in Overwatch 1, but they function a little bit better due to one reason. They had ways to contribute outside of the tank trade, with also more team utility to contribute as well. Orisa's shield, hull, range pressure, and bongo were all phenomenal tools to pressure.
By the way, Orisa's shield was never the problem. I've said this for years. The issue has been and always will be Fortify. That's why even in this game, they removed her shield, and yet she's still hated. Huh. But guys, I thought the shields were the problem. I thought the shields were the issue. I got grilled for years by a lot of creators in this space for talking about double shield and how is the sustain, how I was wrong, and how in 2020, 2019, later that year, I could pull up the VOD where I was surprisingly nice and said, oh, they're great people, but they're getting this wrong. Oh, this Samito guy just wants to complain. God, he's such a bad influence. Why does he have a platform? Blah, 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 blah. How'd that age? How did it age? How did that take of mine age? Fine wine. Like Orisa shield was never the problem. The barriers were never the problem. It was when they decided to change Fortify and make it so that you cannot even headshot her through the ability.
And create space from range. Not in a good way for balance necessarily, but in an impactful way. And for Roadhog, ironically, the rework made him worse because he lost nearly all neutral pressure with the rework to his weapon and his alternate fire. It's either close range, take pressure, hook, and that's about it. You can flank, but if the map doesn't provide those
honestly, guys, they should go back to Old Hog. He had more skill expression, more options, and he was more punishable. The Hog rework is probably the worst rework in Overwatch history. Easily. I think the Roadhog rework in Overwatch 2 was the worst rework in Overwatch history. It didn't help the Hog player. It didn't help the people playing against Hog. And this is why making these tanks try to work in 5v5 is just impossible. Like, they have to leave him bad if that's what they want to do. Like, he was meant to be an open queue flex hero. So it was already hard to fit him in 6v6 Roadhog. It's even more impossible to fit him in 5v5. And reworking him doesn't matter. So it really sucks. But I actually think Old Hog was better for the game.
Or you get poked out, you're cooked. Even newer kids in the block like Ramatra and Malga were
I still hated him, by the way.
was very reliant off of Zarya or another dive tank to enable a lot of his all-in slam cardiac cycles, while being denied by 2 forms of tank mitigation to get his self-heal rolling. And Ramatra CDs are so long and his Omnic form poke so bad at range, they often ended up in just take aggro because bullying the solo tank doesn't work so well anymore. Tanks that demand support without providing consistent utility in return. They don't do well. Maybe there's a synergy in here that can make these heroes work, but we weren't able to solve them in the short period of time that we tried. And point
like
remains,
Ryan Ram would be
whether
good.
weak, dull, or frustrating to play with or against, these heroes are still flops in my eyes on the hero cast. And whether 5v5 or 66, much work is needed to match the creativity, complexity, and dynamics of the other tanks in the cast. Now we're going to get into some feedback here. The last day of Pugs that we did, we spent around 4 or 5 hours playing with only high elo players, Masters, GM, and so on. And we wanted to try to create a more environment where people were more communicating, trying to play optimal tank strategies, and just trying different things. I got some feedback from all of these players that I want to share with you guys here, which will echo some of my points before, and also provide a different perspective. Number 1, let's talk about tanks. Tank felt more limited, but didn't necessarily feel worse. Another player says tank combos heavily affected their enjoyment. Very, very high highs, very low lows, depending on their partner. In addition to that, the good news, though, is that when the combo worked, the attention split from the other tank was definitely noticeable when coordinated or had the right combo. And this is great. In the 5v5 environment, one of the big problems is that all the attention is being put on you. Well, this player says if you get the right tank combo and you communicate and you synchronize well, it's really nice to not feel like everybody's focusing you down all the time. That's great feedback to hear. Now for the DPS players, some of them said that Genji Tracer
By the way,
felt very...
don't forget, you can still get the wrong tank matchup now. And that gap is even worse now than it was before. Because your team had a better chance of undoing that gap previously than they do now. Which is why you see more people instantly counter-swapping in this game than you ever saw in Overwatch 1. The counter-swapping into tanks is almost completely negated in 6v6 compared to 5v5. And when you have the wrong matchup, you could actually break it in the previous game more consistently than you can do now.
Or mobility options, because you could set up a little bit easier than some of the hit scan characters. Felt great. Flexible positioning, and you could actually have decent impact on tank trades. They said that poke heroes felt tough, and it felt sometimes hard to take angles with some DPS. It could be even hard to get support on these angles because your supports were generally more tied up supporting the tank trade. Chokes didn't feel quite as bad as expected, was the general take. For support players, building certain support ults a lot faster was interesting, but you did have to play a little bit more conservative. We'll talk more about that one later. They said there was a lot less room for solo play, and there was a lot more healing, but it was still fun to play. One of the questions brought up by one of the support players has said, is there less room for OTPs because there's less playstyle flexibility in 6v6? Now you might, before you say, oh, playstyle, you can poke tank, you can poke DPS support, we're talking specifically about positioning, because one of the challenges of having more congested chokes is that more of those chokes congested means there's fewer positioning options for unorthodox people. Depending on the choke, you might need a couple of different DPS characters or support characters to break that choke. If you pick the wrong one, you may not have the space that you need to function with that character in that situation. Something worth considering. Now let's share my study notes.
So I will say, I've seen significantly less one-tricks in Overwatch 2 than I did in Overwatch 1. I think that's because the nature of the game is to swap more. Not sure why, but I think that's what it is. That's my guess.
I spent the last day studying from overheads over many of the high elo games we talked about, and not just playing the game, but actually strategizing and taking notes on exactly what could have been done, what felt good, what felt bad. Couple notes here. Number 1, staggering was a bit worse in 66 because there's just more people to mess it up. It's interesting to see how this changes with the wave spawns that they're currently testing in Overwatch right now. Number 2, distance is key for living tank combos / dives as a support or DPS. Proximity is very, very risky because in Overwatch 2, in 5v5, generally you can take a closer angle as long as it's away from the tank.
That is very true.
In 66, there's now twice as many tanks, even though they're a little bit squishier, so you actually need to create a little bit of distance between yourself and the enemy tank and do so consistently because there really isn't any good close angle. I found myself dying a lot more often as a supporter DPS when not necessarily when I was just taking angles in the enemy tank, that's dumb, but a bubbled Winston, a bubbled Zarya, a Matrix to Winston, a bubbled Ryan.
Yeah, you have to respect more things. You have to think.
Top of me, that was a lot harder to avoid through taking angles. You just had to do more stuff, more work through distance management. This reminds me a lot of my old Overwatch 1 coaching, which a lot of time if you're playing support DPS, it was about kind of playing a long distance, playing a corner, trying to keep a long distance between yourself and the enemy tank dive or tank combo that was inevitably coming in. Something to point out. However, after those tanks do commit those cooldowns, they are a lot more vulnerable than they are in Overwatch 2. Moving on from here, tanks must clear and hold space on angles. It is your responsibility to create clear space, not just to group up and choke, but also to contest other chokes. DPS and support cannot consistently do it on their own in most spots, especially if there's an enemy tank there. Angles still matter in 66, just as much as they did in 5v5, but you're a lot more reliant on your tanks to actually control those chokes and angles than you were in Overwatch 2, where there's a little bit more individual autonomy. There's some interesting dynamics that kind of revolve around this, where is it better to support my tank on main or defend clear an angle that's wide open? It becomes more of a priority to support maybe the tanks on main because there's now two of them that you have to support as a healer, but it's a much more of a resource commitment requirement, and then you might leave yourself vulnerable to an angle. It's a tricky balance. Finally, the last thing here, and this is really important, is when you don't have space in 66, hero pick matters a lot more. We talked about this earlier. There's going to be a lot of chokes, a lot of positions. Maybe they don't have verticality, maybe they do have verticality, maybe they have flanks, maybe they don't have flanks, maybe it's close, maybe it's long. You need to pick the right DPS or the support for the situation because taking space with every DPS and with every support character is just not as possible in the 66 format. It's a funny callback to the rock, paper, scissors problems that 5v5 has. 5v5 has the tank rock, paper, scissors, where counterpicking the enemy tank, especially as the tank, can feel more valuable than it has a right to be. And 66, counterpicking the space, counterpicking the map is actually very, very important. Final thoughts here. I'm going to ride the fence with this one because I frankly haven't played the official attempt at 66 and nobody has. But I will say this, I did have a lot of fun and there's a lot of potential for this game mode, especially with appropriate adjustments to hero design and considerations for some of 66 downsides. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, but first, seriously, I encourage you to test these things first, not only to give you a better perspective on exactly the feedback of things, but also because it's just a lot of fun. I'll drop my code in the comments, which is the one that's post-season 9, but you can also have your own matchmaker one that's pre-season 9 and you don't even need to do anything. Just join the Discord and you're ready to roll. It's a lot of fun. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. Let's see what happens.
All right. A pretty good video. I like watching Spylo's takes on it because he thinks, right? A lot of other people, especially towards the beginning, was, it was nonsense. It was just absolute nonsense, and I'm glad that this is being talked about. So here are some things that I would say. One, having the right tank synergy in 6v6 is not as oppressive as having the wrong tank matchup in 5v5. It's just not, especially when they have a flavor of the month tank. There was way more room to pick what you wanted, and there was way more room to play make against those characters outside of double shield. Really outside of double shield. Yeah, I think this was a good video. I think a lot of these things got summarized well. We're going to ultimately have to wait and see how they do it. But I will say, like, I do feel like I had more impact as a DPS player in 6v6 than I do in 5v5. I really do. Because, again, you can't kill the tank now. And the support abilities have all been giga-buffed. All of them. So when you're actually having the one-on-one duel, it feels less oppressive to the DPS player to fight into these abilities. And you have way more options on the map that you can actually chase down and kill. Right? Now, you do have to fight for the space to get those things, but I would much rather have to fight for space in fights that I can win than get a little bit of space for free, and if their tank decides to contest me, I can't fight it at all. So I have to pick a hero like Mei on angles that can survive against a tank flying at me. While in Overwatch 1, while a lot of the times I did have to have a tank with me, if that tank came to me, I could kill it. I could hit a headshot, and it would be almost killing that player because they were way more like DPS. So I'm really excited to see. I'm really excited to see when this code comes out. I'm really excited to see, especially for casuals. I think in the average ranks, this is going to go the longest way. You're going to have way more freedom to play what you want. You don't feel like you're going to have to counter swap as more. Every role is going to be way more relative to each other. That's how you create player agency, when every player is much more relative to each other so they can actually play make on each other better regardless of the role in a role lock format. And right now, And in many different seasons of Overwatch 2, while the promise was to make DPS more fun and have more player agency, that's just not what's happened. And if you look at a lot of the stat lines that get put up in this game right now, I wish he had covered this in his video, but he didn't. You will never have a game in 6v6 where you have 7,000 damage and 7 elims. You could have up to 20 with that level of damage. But all the time now, you'll press tab and you'll sit there with like 4 or 5k damage and 5 elims, and it feels awful. But in 6v6, that will never happen because it's easier to create a kill in 6v6 than it is in 5v5. And the stats will back that per 1k damage dealt. Because obviously, if there's one extra player in each team, you can say, oh, well, Sam, more players are dying, obviously, because there's more players in each team. So, of course, you're going to have more limbs. I would love to see a stat line of the amount of limbs on average per 1k damage, per 5k damage, per 10k damage. And I can promise you, it's not just the difference of having an extra player on each team. I would bet you anything. There are so many more games out there nowadays where like a team's just getting blown out. That's just because there's too much emphasis on the solo tank. It's not healthy for a PvP game. So I'm excited to see how this pans out. I think Spilot was very nuanced and very fair in the video. And I'm very excited to see a lot of the claims that I made get proven right, and a lot of the claims that other people made get proven wrong. Just mainly because it's the misinformation about the old game, and frankly, the revisionist history to sit there and say, oh, it's nostalgia, or, oh, it's just 2 tanks were synergizing, were too powerful, as if the tanks, like 2 tanks synergizing in Overwatch 1 are not nearly as powerful as 1 solo tank by itself passively right now, and those players had to actually execute and play as a team to get that value, and you had more of a chance of piercing it and getting a kill in 6v6 than you do now. So, I don't know. I think this is a great video. I'm excited to see how this playtest goes. Lord knows Overwatch 2 needs it. It's a very bland game, and it's really sad how they took a game that had all this flavor to it, and they removed all the spice. But I'm excited to see what happens when they try it, and hopefully they actually attempt to get it right and don't self-sabotage. But honestly, at this point, I wouldn't put it past them. I wouldn't. I don't know what to expect of these guys anymore. I'm going to give a shout out to our patrons: Burger Billy, GP Hash, Justin Prince, Melvin, Nilo Heen, Z-Cube, AJ, Christopher, Dev, Furkage, Masa, Priat, Sebastian, Tyler, Arietta. I'm not saying last names because I don't figured you guys would not want me to do that. Being Me is Tiring, Axiom, Christian, Dedicated, Halvard, Hera, Hungry Widow, ID, Jake again, Jake R, Jake M, Jordan, Levanoon, Mono, Naz, NBE, Nicholas, Rucate, did I say that right? I'm so sorry. Sid, Steven, that one pronoun, and Yeeta Dog. I appreciate you guys so much. Much love, and yeah, thank you all so much for your support.